Progressive Action in Regressive Times is the name of the Humanists of Florida 2004 conference here in Tampa, Florida. I'm Ed Golly, and we are pleased to be joined by the Reverend Barry W. Lynn, Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Barry, welcome to the set. We're pleased to have you.
Thank you.
We always think you have it backwards. State is always more important than church, but we'll deal with that today. Tell us a little about yourself, who you are, and how you came to be the executive director of this national organization.
All right. Well, I know I'm down here, of course, for a humanist conference, and the ministers at humanist conferences are about as rare as weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But I always like to come to these events because the truth of the matter is there is common need and a common purpose, whether you're a believer or a non-believer in matters of religion, that we need to keep a decent distance between the institutions of government and those of religion. So I was selected as the executive director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State 12 years ago, but the organization is about 52 years old, founded in the end of the 1940s by people representing a number of religious traditions as well as journalists who were then concerned, as many of us still are, about issues like the takeover of education by religious groups. At that time, the activities were frankly most common in the Roman Catholic Church, trying to seize control of public schools. Now we see the same thing going on with fundamentalist evangelical Protestants trying to take over the public schools. The issues don't change much, Ed, over the years, and in fact the founder of Americans United, Glenn Archer, was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's. And Eleanor Roosevelt said to him once, you know, we have to fight these battles in every generation all over again, and sadly, that's turned out to be the truth.
But the battles may be the toughest now because you claim that we now live in the worst of times for those who have any concerns about civil rights, civil liberties, and state-church separation. In fact, you call this the most frightening time you've witnessed in your 55 years. Can you expand about these concerns that you have?
I don't think we've ever seen a time when religious fundamentalists have been so close to capturing control of the United States government and turning it into a theocracy, a government run along their narrow religious lines. The President of the United States, of course, is literally calling the religious right rather than having the religious right call him to get direction about the kinds of policies our country ought to undertake. The Congress is led by people who are frankly also deeply committed to a religious right agenda. You've got Tom DeLay, who basically calls the shots in the House of Representatives, a former pest control company president from Texas, who says he does not believe in evolution, as if that's a matter of belief instead of scientifically valid evidence. And of course, Bill Frist over in the United States Senate has been labeled as a true blue friend by the Family Research Council, one of the most aggressive religious right lobbying groups in Congress. Sometimes people say about to him, well, he must be okay. I mean, after all, he's a doctor. But sometimes I ask him to think Dr. Strangelove. And the court, which of course this administration wants to pack with ideological conservatives of the farthest right kind, is just one or two votes away from being able to overturn important decisions in church-state, as well as to overturn Roe versus Wade and return America to the dark ages of reproductive freedom.
The Patriot Act. I actually know people who claim that they really are unconcerned about it because they're not Arabic, so they don't really see this as affecting them or their civil rights, since they're not going to be the ones who are arrested, jailed, or investigated. In fact, they think the Patriot Act is serving to make them safer because it's going to target people who are of foreign nationalities posing a potential threat to our country. Can you talk to that for us, Barry?
You know, the USA Patriot Act, and what is worse, some of the things that the President would like to add to it, concern and should concern every American interested in his or her own personal privacy. I mean, there are provisions in the Patriot Act that allow for the government, on the basis of really no evidence whatsoever, no probable cause, no particular evidence that they can present, to get records of what you take out of the library, what books you buy in bookstores. These are things that have become so outrageous for so many, even conservatives, that some of the conservative members of Congress are calling for the repeal of individual sections of that act. And even when the government goes after things like the records of Islamic charities, looking for possible terrorist connections, can you imagine what would happen if this were done of Christian charities, some of which, shall we say, haven't had the perfectly clean record in the past? But it would be an outrage. And of course, the loss of liberty, as you know, Ed, often occurs first among those that have the least popular views. But then, once the government has the power to search, to seize records, to scrutinize your life, they turn it on the next group, and finally all Americans find that Big Brother is literally in their bedroom, their kitchen, and every place else in their house.
But then the organizations in this country, such as yours, Americans United, the ACLU, are organizations whose focus is on maintaining civil liberties. And the amazing thing to me about it is that civil liberties are possibly the most cherished aspect of our Constitution, our form of government. Why is it then that so many Americans hold in such high contempt the type of organizations that are devoted to protecting our civil liberties?
You know, it really is shocking that civil liberties, which of course are protected by the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is a pretty conservative document. It protects the rights of the people against the otherwise overarching power of government or of majorities to dictate what we are able to think about religion, what we're able to do about religion, what we're able to read and print. So there really are some conservatives, to their credit, who might be social conservatives on some issues, or fiscal conservatives, but who recognize that the intrusiveness of the Patriot Act makes them, in some cases, even join organizations like Americans United and like the ACLU in larger numbers now than ever before, because they're starting to see that if you truly are a conservative, you want to conserve basic principles. Those basic principles are where? In the Constitution of the United States of America.
But then in keeping with that point, the Constitution is there to protect us from the intrusions on our civil liberties, and yet it seems that the government that we have in power now is just steamrolling a lot of those civil liberties. So many Americans seem to be misled into thinking our nation's a democracy, and whatever the majority wants that you've been referring to is what they should have, regardless of what protections are really in the Constitution. Now, is that the fault of self-serving politicians who just ignore the Constitution, or is it a shortcoming of an educational system that doesn't really familiarize Americans with what their Constitution is intended to do for us?
You know, there's a lot of blame to go around. The truth of the matter is that pandering by politicians has gotten worse and worse and worse in the decades that I've been in Washington. You know, after the controversial, but I think absolutely correct decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that the Pledge of Allegiance should not contain the words "under God," the most dangerous place in Washington to be was between a politician and a television camera, because they were all rushing in front of any camera they could find to say, no, we like "Under God," and in fact, we can probably sing a couple stanzas of "God Bless America." So they do pander to this notion that they have to support the majoritarian religious view in order to keep elected. Now, I have to say, too, that public schools are often under such pressure, particularly by religious right groups, that they don't always teach about the Constitution. They really don't talk about how individual people, religious, non-religious, have been able to go to the United States Supreme Court in the past and defend their rights, including their rights to be different. So the public school system is under pressure. Don't teach sex education, don't teach, heaven's sakes, evolution, and don't even teach an honest history of our country.
Well, you brought up the case of Michael Newdow that's going to be heard now before the Supreme Court on March 24th. If he prevails and the court finds that the two words "under God" is in fact unconstitutional, can this pave the way for organizations like yours to pursue other remedies against, for example, the religious graffiti on our currency or our national motto changed from "E pluribus unum" into "In God We Trust"?
I do think that Michael Newdow is going to win this case before the United States Supreme Court, and at least, at a minimum, uphold the decision for those Western states affected, and included in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I think, frankly, he could easily get 5 votes and win this for all Americans around the country. I do think that this does not necessarily mean that every aspect of what you've referred to as religious graffiti. I think sociologists have a somewhat a little more sophisticated way to call. They now refer to it as ceremonial deism, but it's the same thing. It's just these references to a generic God. I'm not sure I know who believes in a generic God. I think most of us who believe in God are more specific about it. But the truth is that this will not necessarily mean that there can never be a religious phrase on coins, but it will mean that when you have young people in a public school being told by an authority figure, this is the time now to pledge allegiance, and that pledge is a religious test, not a political test, but a religious loyalty oath every day, that is going to be constitutionally forbidden. So it will set the record straight. It would be a right thing for the Supreme Court to do, but I wouldn't count on them immediately deciding that In God We Trust should go back off the coins, even though, of course, most Americans believe it was always there. The truth is it didn't appear on any coins until the 2-cent piece was issued following the Civil War. So like many other myths, the myth of In God We Trust as a permanent part of our money is just bogus. By the way, if just being close to some kind of a religious phrase made us a religious people, the mere fact that we have Gideon Bibles and motel nightstands would have stopped adultery by now, and it hasn't.
Speaking of mythology, I remember when the Newdow case was first heard and decided by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, there was sort of an outpouring, especially on a lot of the conservative talk shows, both on radio and television, that this country was founded in Christian principles and that these 10 commandments, I guess maybe referring also to the Judge Moore case, are the basis of the laws that we have, the democracy that we have. The very structure of our country couldn't exist in its present form without the full influence of Christianity.
The truth is this is not a Christian nation. It's not just that I don't think it was founded as a Christian nation. The historical record is absolutely clear, and Washington and Adams and early presidents made those specific kinds of statements. The Declaration of Independence does talk about nature's God, but that has nothing to do with the construction of God as a Jerry Falwell or a Pat Robertson would talk about God today. These were people who at most were deists. That was the clear majority sentiment of the people who both signed the Declaration of Independence and later crafted what has been called a godless constitution. That is to say, our original Constitution has only one reference to religion, and that is that there shall be no religious test for public office. Beyond that, there's no reference to God. That was quite deliberate because this was founded as a secular republic, that is, a government to be run along secular principles, not anyone's particular religious views, including those of Christians.
Another myth we hear is that, well, actually it's not a myth, it's truth. There is no phrase in our Constitution that establishes a wall of separation. But of course the First Amendment does define the Establishment Clause, I guess is what we call it. And as I understand it, Jefferson, who was sort of influential in the founding of the country and the Constitution, defined this to his letter to the Danbury Baptists. This is really a legitimate expression that we can use to really define the role of religion and government and how the two should stay separate, even though it doesn't appear in the Constitution. Isn't that right?
There are a lot of phrases that don't appear in the Constitution, but where the idea is absolutely a bedrock principle. Separation of church and state, admittedly, isn't there, but 16 words are that say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Other ideas that we have that people assume are in the Constitution, separation of powers, the fact that the courts do some things, legislatures do things, that's not in the Constitution either. A fair trial, everyone thinks that's in the Constitution, but it's not. It's just a shorthand phrase of reflecting what a set of articles of the